Hannah Vogel made 3 mistakes in the autumn of 1987. The first was agreeing to record those audio diaries. The second was playing them back. The third was not stopping when she realized the voice responding to her on the tape wasn't her own. The cassette recorder was a Sony TC-D5M, silver and black, the kind journalists used in the field. Dr. Lucas Reinhardt handed it to her during their 3rd appointment at his clinic in Freiburg and told her it might help track patterns in her seizures. "Keep a diary," he said. "Talk about what you're feeling, what you remember when the episodes happen." Standard protocol for temporal lobe epilepsy patients in 1987. Hannah took it home to Waldkirch on a Thursday afternoon in October. The leaves were already turning brown along the road that cut through the Black Forest, and the air had that particular smell of approaching winter in southern Germany. Damp earth and wood smoke and something else, something older that you couldn't quite name. She rode the bus back from Freiburg with the recorder in her lap, turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than she expected. That night, she made her first recording. The tape begins with the click of the record button, then Hannah's voice, slightly nervous, introducing herself. She was 19, studying literature at university in Stuttgart, before the seizures got bad enough that she had to come home. She described what the episodes felt like, how time would skip, how she'd lose minutes or sometimes hours, how afterward her mouth would taste like copper and her head would feel stuffed with cotton. Her voice was clear, measured, the voice of someone used to reading aloud in seminars and taking careful notes. The recording lasted 7 minutes. When she played it back, it lasted 9. She noticed it right away. The counter on the machine didn't match up. She thought maybe she'd recorded over an old tape by mistake, but no. This was fresh from the package. She rewound it and listened again. 7 minutes of her voice, then 2 minutes of silence. Except it wasn't quite silence. If you turned the volume up, you could hear something underneath. A sound like fabric moving, like someone shifting their weight from foot to foot in a room with wooden floors. Hannah unplugged the recorder and put it in her desk drawer. She didn't tell Dr. Reinhardt about it during their next appointment. Waldkirch was the kind of town where everyone knew which houses had been there before the war and which had been rebuilt after. The Vogel family had lived in the same stone house near the church for 4 generations, close enough that Hannah could hear the bells every morning at 6. Her mother, Eva, kept the household running with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from decades of practice. Laundry on Mondays, market on Wednesdays, Mass every Sunday without fail. Eva's hands were always moving, always working, but her eyes had a distant quality, like she was constantly doing calculations in her head that never quite added up. The house itself was cold that winter, not just the normal cold of old German houses with thick walls and small windows. This was different, the kind of cold that settled in your chest and stayed there. Hannah started wearing 2 sweaters indoors. Eva kept the radiators turned up higher than usual, but it didn't help. The cold seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. Hannah's father had died 6 years earlier. Heart attack, sudden, no warning. Since then, it had just been the 2 of them. Eva praying her rosary every evening in the kitchen. Hannah studying or trying to study when her head wasn't foggy from the medication. The medication wasn't working. Dr. Reinhardt was stumped, though he didn't say it that directly. He was 42 with the kind of face that aged well, sharp features, graying hair at the temples, wire-rimmed glasses he was constantly adjusting. He'd been practicing neurology for 15 years and had seen hundreds of epilepsy cases. Hannah's seizures didn't fit the pattern. The EEG readings showed nothing during her episodes. Her brain scans were clean. Blood work was normal. But the episodes were getting longer, sometimes 30 minutes where she'd sit completely still, eyes open but not seeing, barely breathing, and she was getting thinner. By November, Hannah had lost 7 kilograms. Eva tried to get her to eat, setting out her favorite meals, but Hannah would just sit at the table and stare at the food like it was a problem she couldn't solve. She'd pick up her fork, hold it for a moment, then set it down again. When Eva asked what was wrong, Hannah would say she wasn't hungry. Not that she didn't feel like eating, not that her stomach hurt, just that she wasn't hungry. Like it was a simple fact, nothing emotional about it. But here's the thing, Eva didn't push. Not the way a frightened mother should. She'd set the plate down, watch Hannah refuse it, then quietly take it away. No tears, no pleading. She'd just return to the kitchen and continue praying her rosary, but the prayers were different. If you listened closely, they weren't prayers for healing. They were prayers for endurance, for silence, for something to be over quickly, like she'd been expecting this all along. Dr. Reinhardt noted the weight loss in his files. He also noted something else. Hannah's affect was flattening. That was the clinical term. It meant her emotional responses were becoming muted, her voice more monotone. When he asked her questions, she'd answer clearly but without inflection. No smiles, no frowns, just words delivered in that increasingly flat voice. But there was something else he noticed that he couldn't quite categorize. During their November appointment, he asked Hannah about her plans after recovery. Did she want to return to university? What was she reading? Hannah looked at him blankly for a moment, then said she didn't read anymore. Reading was too loud. Dr. Reinhardt asked what she meant by that. Hannah explained that when she tried to read, she could hear the words being spoken. Not in her head the way you normally hear your inner voice when reading, but out loud, in different voices, sometimes children's voices, sometimes older women. It made it hard to know which thoughts were hers. Dr. Reinhardt wrote this down, but his pen hovered over the paper for a long time afterward. The phrasing bothered him. Not I hear voices, but it's hard to know which thoughts are hers. Like the thoughts existed separately, and she was just the space they occupied. He suggested a psychiatric evaluation. Hannah declined. She told him, very calmly, that she didn't need a psychiatrist because she wasn't losing her mind. She was just listening. Listening to what? Dr. Reinhardt wanted to know. Hannah looked at him with those increasingly flat eyes and said that was the wrong question. The question wasn't what she was listening to. The question was how much of her would be left when she was done. The second recording Hannah made was in early November. She'd taken the recorder out of the drawer because Dr. Reinhardt had asked about it, wanted to know if the diary was helping. She sat on her bed late at night, the lamp casting long shadows up the wall, and pressed record. She talked about the cold in the house, about how her mother kept looking at her with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't quite worry either. About how sometimes during her episodes, she'd feel herself getting smaller, thinner, not just her body, though that was happening too, but her presence, like she was taking up less space in the room even though she hadn't moved. She described how during the last episode, she'd stood up to get water and caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. For just a second, maybe less, she didn't recognize herself. The face in the mirror looked right, the features were all correct, but the expression was wrong, too still, too old, like someone was wearing her face and hadn't quite figured out how it was supposed to move. She stopped recording after 5 minutes and played it back immediately. This time, there was no silence at the end. This time, there was a voice. Not her voice. Older, rougher, speaking German but with an accent she didn't recognize. The words were unclear, like they were coming through water, but she caught fragments. Something about names, something about records, something about the basement. And then, very clearly, in a child's voice, "We were so hungry." Hannah felt the temperature in her room drop. You know that feeling when you step into a walk-in freezer, how the cold hits the back of your throat first. It was like that. Her breath came out in small clouds. The lamp beside her bed flickered once, twice, then steadied. She ejected the tape and looked at it. Just a normal cassette, TDKSA 90, the kind you could buy at any electronics shop. She turned it over in her hands. The plastic was ice cold. That's when she noticed her fingers. The tips were blue. Father Matthias Keller had been avoiding the rectory basement for 3 weeks, and he couldn't explain why. It wasn't a conscious decision. He'd go to get something from storage, reach the top of the stairs, and find himself turning around. He'd tell himself he'd do it later, that he had other things to handle first. But it kept happening. The avoidance was instinctive, the way you'd avoid touching a hot stove, your hand pulling back before your brain could process why. He'd been the priest of Waldkirch for 23 years, and in that time he'd learned that faith in small towns worked differently than in cities. It was quieter, deeper, woven into everyday life in ways that didn't require discussion. People went to Mass because that's what you did. They baptized their children, buried their dead in the churchyard, kept their mouths shut about certain things. But there were gaps in the collective memory, conversations that stopped when certain topics came up, sections of the church that no one entered, not because they were locked, but because no one wanted to. Father Keller had noticed how the older parishioners would change the subject if you mentioned the war years, how they'd redirect any questions about who had lived where, who had left, who had stayed. It was like the whole town had agreed to forget the same things at the same time. When Eva Vogel approached him after Mass in early December and asked if he might visit Hannah, something passed across her face that made Father Keller's stomach tighten. Not panic, not even fear, just a kind of weary recognition, like she'd been waiting for this conversation her whole life. She asked if he could come on Tuesday evening. Then she added very quietly that he shouldn't mention the forest, or the basement, or anything about the war years. Father Keller asked why. Eva's hands were twisting her rosary beads so hard the cord was digging into her skin. She said that some things, once you started talking about them, didn't stop, that Hannah was already listening to too much, that the best thing they could do was pray it would be quick. Father Keller visited on Tuesday evening as promised. The Vogel house was dark, even with the lights on, the kind of darkness that seemed to pool in the corners. Hannah was in her room upstairs. When he knocked, she told him to come in. Her voice was flat, emotionless. She was sitting on the bed, the cassette recorder beside her. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in 3 months, skin stretched tight over her bones, shadows under her eyes so dark they looked like bruises, hair that had gone dull and lifeless. But her eyes were sharp, too sharp, like she was seeing things at angles other people couldn't. And here's the thing that Father Keller noticed, the thing that made his throat close up. Hannah wasn't quite sitting on the bed. She was hovering maybe a centimeter above it, not floating, nothing dramatic, just not quite touching, like the weight of her had decreased to the point where gravity was negotiable. He blinked and she was sitting normally, but his hands were shaking. Father Keller introduced himself, though of course she knew who he was. He asked how she was feeling. Hannah said she was fine. Then she asked him about Father Wilhelm. The room got colder. Father Wilhelm had been the priest before Father Keller, back in the 1950s and early 60s. He died in 1963, before Hannah was even born. There was no reason she should know his name. Father Keller asked how she knew about Father Wilhelm. Hannah tilted her head, not like she was thinking, but like she was listening to something he couldn't hear. She said Father Wilhelm's name was in the records, the old records, the ones from the war, the ones in the basement he'd been avoiding. She said Father Wilhelm had written some of it down, the names, what happened to them, where they'd been sent when the food ran low and winter came early. Then Hannah said something that made Father Keller's blood go cold. She said Father Wilhelm used to stand at the top of the basement stairs, just like Father Keller had been doing. That he'd stand there for minutes at a time, trying to make himself go down, and then he'd turn around and go pray instead. There was no way Hannah could know that. There was no way anyone could know that. That night, after leaving the Vogel house, Father Keller forced himself down to the rectory basement. The air down there smelled like old paper and mildew and, well, something else. Something sweet and rotten that he'd never noticed before. His hands were trembling so badly it took him 3 tries to pull the chain on the overhead bulb. The ledgers were on a wooden shelf against the back wall. He pulled out the volumes from 1943 to 1945 and went through them page by page. That's when he noticed the gap behind the shelf. Not a gap exactly. More like a space where the wall should have been flush, but wasn't. He moved the shelf aside. It was lighter than it looked, like someone had moved it many times before and found a hollow space behind it. Inside was a notebook, small, leather-bound, unmarked. The pages were filled with handwriting, different hands, different inks, spanning from 1943 to 1945. But all the entries followed the same format: date, name, age, cause of death, and then at the end of each entry, burial refused. 27 entries, all women and children. The last entry was in Father Wilhelm's handwriting, just 2 lines: God forgive us. They asked for bread, and we gave them directions to the forest. Father Keller's hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the notebook. The basement suddenly felt much smaller, the air heavier. The bulb overhead flickered, and just for a moment, just for a second, he heard it. The sound of children crying, very far away, like it was coming from beneath the floor. But here's what made him run back upstairs. Here's what made him lock his office door and sit there until dawn. The crying wasn't coming from below. It was coming from inside the walls, like it had been there the whole time, just waiting for someone to hear it. By December, Hannah had stopped using pronouns correctly. She'd refer to herself as we sometimes, or she'd start a sentence with I and finish it with they. Dr. Reinhardt documented this in his notes, but couldn't categorize it. Not dissociative identity disorder. There was no switching, no lost time. Hannah seemed aware of what she was doing. She just didn't see it as incorrect. During one appointment, she explained it to him. She said that when you listen to enough voices, you start to realize that I is just a habit, that the self is mostly just the loudest voice in your head, drowning out the others. And when that voice gets quieter, you realize how crowded it's been all along. Dr. Reinhardt asked her if the other voices were getting louder. Hannah said no. Her voice was getting quieter, thinner, taking up less space, making room. She said it the way you'd describe rearranging furniture. The weight loss accelerated in January. Hannah stopped eating entirely. Not gradually, just stopped. Eva would put food in front of her and Hannah would look at it with that flat expression and say she wasn't hungry. When Eva pressed her, gently, never forcefully, Hannah would explain very calmly that eating felt wrong, like she was taking something that wasn't hers, like the body she was in was supposed to be empty. Dr. Reinhardt hospitalized her for 5 days, forced fluids, tried to stabilize her weight. The nurses reported that Hannah would lie in bed completely still for hours, barely blinking, barely breathing. Sometimes her lips would move like she was talking to someone, but no sound came out. One nurse, an older woman named Petra, who'd worked in the hospital for 30 years, refused to take the night shift in Hannah's room after the second night. When pressed, she finally said that the air in Hannah's room didn't circulate right. That when you stood near the bed, you could feel cold spots, specific areas where the temperature dropped by several degrees, and that once, when she'd checked Hannah's pulse, the skin under her fingers had felt like wax. Not cold wax, room temperature wax, like there was nothing generating heat underneath anymore. Another nurse mentioned, almost as an aside in the staff notes, that Hannah's chart kept getting moved. She'd leave it at the nurse's station, clipped to the board in alphabetical order, and 10 minutes later, it would be on the floor by Hannah's door. This happened 6 times in 3 days. The nurse who reported it suggested maybe the night janitor was bumping it, but her handwriting in the report got smaller and smaller, like she was trying not to commit fully to the explanation. Nobody followed up on it. Hannah was released on day 6. She'd gained back 0.5 kilogram, enough to satisfy the discharge requirements. But something had changed. Her eyes had changed. They weren't just sharp anymore. They were ancient, like something very old was looking out through a 19-year-old's face. And her shadow was wrong. Dr. Reinhardt noticed it when Hannah stood up to leave his office for the last time. The shadow on the wall behind her didn't quite match her movements. It lagged by maybe 0.5 second. Not enough that you'd consciously register it, but enough that your brain would flag it as wrong. He found himself looking away from it, focusing on Hannah's face instead, but the wrongness of that shadow stayed with him. He never wrote it in his notes. The final recording was made on February 11th, 1989. Hannah sat in her room with the recorder and pressed the button. Her voice was barely a whisper, but every word was precise. She started listing names, 27 names, each one followed by a date and a place, specific locations in the forest northeast of town, clearings that no one visited, areas where the ground stayed frozen even in summer. Then she explained what had happened during the war, how the church had sheltered people, yes, but not all people equally, how choices had been made about who deserved protection and who didn't, how some refugees were given food and new papers and safe passage, while others were quietly sent into the forest and told to keep walking, how 27 women and children had died out there, some from exposure, some from starvation, some from things Hannah's voice wouldn't specify, how none of them had received proper burial rites, how their bodies had been left in shallow graves marked only by stones, how they'd been so hungry, how they still were. Hannah's voice on the tape changed then, got thinner, more transparent, like she was speaking from very far away. She said they hadn't been asking for release or revenge. They'd been asking for space, for a body that could hold them, for someone to let them in. She said she'd made room. She said there was almost none of her left now, just enough to record this last message. She said it was better this way, that being empty was easier than being full of yourself. She said they were hungry, and she was the only food that mattered. Not bread, not meat, but presence, existence, the space that a person takes up in the world. She said she was almost gone. The tape ended. Hannah Vogel died 3 days later on February 14th, 1989. Medical examiners ruled the cause of death as organ failure secondary to severe malnutrition and dehydration. But the autopsy report contained one note that was later redacted from the official record. Hannah's body weighed 31 kilograms at death, but when they moved her onto the examination table, 3 different technicians reported that she felt heavier than she looked, like the mass was distributed wrong, like she was denser than she should be, like she was full of something. The court case focused on whether her parents and doctors had done enough to force treatment. Dr. Reinhardt's license was reviewed. Father Keller was transferred to a parish in Baden-Württemberg. Eva stayed in Waldkirch, but stopped going to Mass. The cassette tapes were sealed as evidence and stored in a diocese archive in Munich. The notebook, Father Keller found was never officially mentioned in any report. But in 1992, during construction of a new road northeast of Waldkirch, construction crews found remains. 27 sets, women and children. The diocese paid for a memorial, a small stone marker with no names, just dates, 1943 to 1945. Eva died in 2003. In her effects, they found a letter she'd written but never sent. In it, she explained that her grandmother had told her stories when she was young. Stories about the church basement, about who had hidden there during the war, about the decisions that were made when food ran short and winter came early, about how the town had agreed, collectively and silently, to forget. She wrote that she'd known from the moment Hannah came home that this was going to happen, that the town's silence had weight, and that weight had to go somewhere, that Hannah had always been too sensitive, too open, too willing to listen. She wrote that she'd tried to make it quick, that she'd stopped pushing Hannah to eat because fighting only made it last longer, that the kindest thing she could do was pray for endurance, not Hannah's endurance, but her own. She wrote that Hannah had been right. They just needed someone to make room. The recorder Hannah used is supposedly still in that Munich archive. According to the catalogue, it's stored in a climate-controlled vault, powered off, the tape still inside. But there's a notation in the file from 2008, added by an archivist during a routine inventory check. The notation says, "Battery compartment empty, tape counter still advancing, weight inconsistent with components. No one's been down to check on it since. And in Waldkirch, in houses near the church, people still report that some rooms are colder than others, that sometimes, late at night, you can hear the sound of someone talking very quietly, not to you, just talking, making conversation with something you can't see. Most people turn up the television when it happens. Some people move, but everyone knows better than to listen too closely. Because once you start listening, you see, once you really open yourself up to what's being said, well, you start to realize how much empty space you're carrying around inside you, and how badly something else wants to fill it. That's all that's been recovered. You can turn your light off now, but before you do, listen closely to the quiet. The silence isn't empty. We'll be waiting for you next week, same day at 3 a.m., when a new record starts to play. Until then, try not to listen too closely.